I'm talking with the composer Robert Honstein, and it's been 8 months since we talked, Robert. Last time I had you on, we were talking about your album Soul House that you did with Hub New Music, and now you've got a piece called Middle Ground that has just come out this past month, I believe, from Other Minds recordings. And this is a piece that you wrote back in, I guess, 2016, thereabouts. So
That's
you're kind of, I would say you were a little bit ahead of the curve in that a lot of composers are kind of jumping on the let's explore what a single instrument can do kind of piece, but you've been doing this for some time. And listening to it now, you can't help but view it in the context of what's been going on for the past year. Let's talk a little bit about what the piece is. First of all, it's for violin and processed electronics. Can you sort of describe what Middle Ground is? Give us the overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So the work is for violin and processed electronics, as you said. The electronics are mostly digital delays and reverbs, but quite simply, it's kind of an expression of two poles attempting to come together, and that metaphor is really placed on the violin itself. The first movement, called Too Far, begins extremely high in the violin, this very, very high melody, just sort of cloudy and floating. And gradually over the course of that movement, it slowly descends into the lower register of the violin. Then the second movement is almost entirely in the lower register. It's called Too Close. And it's much more aggravated and rhythmic and disjunct, and has a lot more of this kind of intense energy, and it's all in the lower register, and it also kind of has a distorted sound to it. So these two movements in kind of very large blocks set out the opposition of these two poles that are as far apart as you can get on both register in the violin and also in character, musical character, I'd say, as well. And then the third movement, Bridging the Gap, is kind of, as you might imagine, an attempt to reconcile. So the music, quite literally, is just an alternating almost between tones that are high and tones that are low. And really the drama of that movement is just, how will these two voices come together? Will they come together? And gradually over the course of this movement, it's like these two voices get closer and closer, and then they kind of go apart, and then they get closer and they go apart. And then kind of, I would say, the climax of the movement, and maybe even of the whole piece, is they're finally just getting super close, and it starts to get a little bit more dissonant, a little bit more tense. And to my ear, they never quite reach. They get as close as they can, but it's never quite a real sense of resolution. It's like they've tried, and then the final, I'd say, coda is almost sort of like an acceptance of, an acceptance of just we're never quite going to get there, but we'll accept. So there is a kind of a resolution, but it's not as if they've really found the middle ground. It's more like they've accepted that there's a difference, and agreed to move on. So it's really a metaphor that's sort of cast in these really, I think, clear musical terms that we hear play out over the course of the piece.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you talk about, especially the end and the resolution or a lack thereof. I mean,
Yeah,
in the music, there's, like you say, these opposite poles kind of trying to come together, but they're repelling each other in this
yeah,
case.
yeah,
And you've got this big A major triad, and you think, oh, the piece is finishing very nicely. Put a bow on top; it's all cut and dried. And then you have sort of this little elegiac almost epilogue, which
yeah,
ends with a minor
yeah,
triad. So for you,
yeah.
that is acceptance, yeah?
Yeah, well, a sort of, yeah, it's not resolution, but it's acceptance. It's saying that yeah, I feel that's a kind of acceptance. It's not saying, which I feel is different than resolution. Acceptance doesn't mean that you've come to a compromise. It just means you've accepted it for what it is. So to me, you call it as elegiac, but I also hear it as somewhat a kind of stark sort of austere quality. It's not necessarily a joyful ending. It's more, I think it's an honest ending. It's an honest assessment of this is
Yeah.
what it is, and um, and that's it, you know. And it's interesting you mentioned the A major. I mean, that's a detail that I don't necessarily expect people to pick up on, but it's something I think about as a composer because it actually ends kind of in G minor, and you know, I sort of thought of this A major as like everything about it rhetorically and the arrival. It sort of feels like this is the cadence, and like you said, okay, we're going to resolve. But you know, A major doesn't go to G minor directly, right? It's actually a step away from
Mhm.
resolution, and so there's a kind of a jarring shift tonally, so to speak, between this supposed resolution and where we actually end up, which is in my mind this kind of metaphor of like don't quite get there. It's close. It's as close as they could be, but it's not quite wrapped up in a bow and where it needs to be. So it's sort of a false that A major thing, arrival, is sort of a false sense of arrival, I think, or a false sense of completion.
Yeah.
It's kind of a little trick, I guess, musically speaking.
Well, it's very effective. You know, I hear you in all of this music. That first movement is so lyric and so beautiful. And to look at the page, you see all these large leaps, and everything is above the staff, as you mentioned. It's very high. But there's also a lot of melody and there's a lot of drama, and a lot of
Mm,
that is helped along by how the electronics are used in
yeah,
this piece. But and I heard this in Soul House too. There seems to be a sense of I don't want to say nostalgia, but a sense of memory, a sense of looking back at something that is
yeah,
part of your style. Can you talk a
yeah.
little bit about your own personal musical style?
Absolutely. I mean, it's something I think about. I think all the time. What my personal style, my personal voice is. I think about it in the sense of I feel like I'm always discovering what that is. If you asked me that question 5 years ago, I think I would have a different sense of it. But and I feel like to a certain extent I'm discovering it anew in every piece I write. But I do agree with you. There is a sense of nostalgia and there is a sense of memory that is a part of what I do. I don't know why, but I feel like I'm just drawn to thinking about the past. I'm you know I'm kind of an introspective person. I think for me one of the engines of my creativity is looking inwards, and oftentimes looking inwards means reflecting on my life, my experience, and I think that does come out sometimes in that sense of nostalgia that you speak of, and it it feels actually like nostalgia is sort of a buzzword these days, and I'm trying to reconcile what that means for me because it's not just to me about some sort of escapism. It's not necessarily about looking at it with rose colored glasses and just sort of um, creating a fantasy version of the past. It's sometimes it's quite beautiful, I agree, and quite lyrical. And in Soul House, certainly remembering childhood, I think there are moments where it has that sense of like this wonderful sort of memory. But I do think there's something in it that's I don't want to get too heavy or whatever, but there's a kind of existential dread quality to that sense of nostalgia. You know, looking backwards as a way of um, somehow coping with the fact that we don't know what's in front of us. So even though it can be like a cozy, warm blanket, I think that it is ultimately a way of coping with the fear that we all face just every day, about what's next. And so yeah, there's a bit of that tension, even though I do agree. Oftentimes, I allow myself to just sort of indulge in a kind of looking back in a positive way. There's both sides of it. It's sort of, there's a lightness and a darkness that I think is part of what makes it work. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think that the contrast and the drama that's inherent in your style is great for people to listen to come up with their own
yeah.
ideas and their own feelings. It obviously speaks very well in that regard. Just a sidebar, I'm still waiting for you to identify the secret place in the Soul House.
No,
Someday
sorry, I can't.
we'll find that out.
It's best to keep it's best to keep people waiting for certain things.
Um,
That's part of the tension, part of the drama.
yeah,
But I
yeah,
do like what you said about, finding your own stories in it. And I think that's a wonderful thing about music. You know, I do think in a certain sense, I think of music as a form of storytelling. You know, every movement or every piece, it has a kind of narrative quality to it, and it has a drama, and it has a way of pulling you along, but it's obviously it's not specific, it's not literal, it's not literary. There's no words, you know, unless there are words, but even so, the music is abstract, and it's about these abstract relationships, and I think it's wonderful that people can project their own experiences onto it. I mean, I think that's part of how music moves beyond me and can reach other people and mean something to other people. So I really embrace that, and I also think, you know, in the way I talk about my music or the way I frame it, you know, just in terms of whether it be the title or the program note, I like to suggest a context. I mean, some pieces, like Soul House, have maybe more specificity, but even within that concept, I think there's a lot of room for interpretation. And a piece like Middle Ground is, I think, even a little more abstract. I mean, there is a framing device, which I think you can hear, as we talked about, of finding the middle ground and the compromise and the extremes and whatnot. And that locates you in a sort of a space, a context. But there's a lot of abstraction. There's a lot left for you, the listener, or anyone to provide themselves. And I think that's a really important part of how, certainly how I engage with music, and how I would love people to engage with my music, you know, to sort of fill in the blanks and create their own world, sort of using the input that I've given them, but then there's space for them to create their own experience with it, you know?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about how you use the electronics? I've looked at the score and it's all kind of Greek to me. I mean, I can
Yeah.
understand that you have the violin hooked up to a microphone, to the computer and the speaker and what have you, but how does that work when a person, well, first of all, when you're composing the piece, how are
Yeah.
you incorporating electronics? And then how are they interpreted? How are they used?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the score doesn't have a ton of information about the electronics, because the score is really a document for the performer to have what they need to play it, and the performer doesn't have to actively do so much with the electronics. I've kind of already got it set up. The way it works is, essentially, there's a program that has the processing that I use built in for each movement. And, you know, each movement has different settings, different processings. Like I said, they're mostly delays. And for anyone who doesn't know what a delay is, think of it like an echo. It's like if I were to say something and then you hear to say the same thing repeated a certain amount of time later, except I can control how many echoes and how long those echoes are, you know, spaced out. And so that's the delay. And then in the second movement, there's delay and this distortion effect. The distortion is kind of what makes the tone have that gnarly quality. And the way you know, I'm not particularly sophisticated in terms of programming and whatnot. I just sort of use a program and mess around with the settings until I get it to be what I want, and then that's what it is. And as far as though how it relates to the composing, that is, I think, really important. And I certainly wrote the piece with the processing in mind, and certainly factored that in quite heavily into how the piece was structured and how it unfolded. And I mean, I guess on a technical level, each movement has a different delay setting, and actually even that sort of reflects with this structure I set out of coming together, because the first movement, the delays are really spread out, and I kind of tried to do something which I hadn't tried before, which was there's like a number of delays that are sort of a certain predictable amount, like getting further apart. But then there's this one delay that's like 10 seconds out. It's like so far out that when it finally comes back, it almost sounds like it's just a canonical voice or a contrapuntal voice more than it does an actual delay. But that choice of having it be so spread out is what kind of creates that sense of space in the first movement, and that sense of it being like a web, like sort of almost like a polyphonic sort of sense of the first movement. It's like a web of counterpoint. But then actually what happens, the delays get shorter and shorter as with each movement. So the second movement, the delays are much shorter, closer to each other. And then the third movement, they're so close, the delays are so close that it almost doesn't even sound like delay. It just sounds like reverb, which is to say, it just sounds like a sustained tone that sort of like fades away, indefinitely. And that's because the delays are so close. If you imagine a violin playing a long note, if you have like 4 echoes that happen like just milliseconds after it, you don't even notice that it's an echo. You just notice this long note that kind of gets extended and sort of dissolves into the space. So I was thinking about this notion of coming together, with regard to the delays themselves, with each movement getting closer and closer. That was another kind of subtle structural thing. But also I thought it was interesting. I feel like the spacing of the delays immediately affect the structure of the music. So like I said, that first movement, it's so much more spacious. That has a totally different character than the second movement when they're very close together. So that was a huge part of my process in creating the sound world that existed for each movement.
Yeah, the relationship between the writing for the violin and the way you describe the delays so fits into the overall concept of the idea. And I imagine your acoustic music has to sort of get out of the way sometimes of what's going
Yeah.
on with the delays.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and if one were to really look at the details of the score, I think you could see it's most obvious in the first movement, because in the first movement there's lots of spaces, lots of rests, frankly, and the reason there's lots of rests is because to accommodate all the echoing that's happening, so that gives it space to breathe and to hear those echoes, and then part of kind of how that first movement works, and part of I think the drama is it's not just the coming from super high to super low, it's also the compression of the space. So whereas in the first maybe page you're going to see lots of rests, lots of space in between the phrases, by the end there's not really any rest and it's continuous, and what that ends up producing is I think a sense of things cascading, things kind of getting closer together, which creates I think a building momentum over the course of the piece. So yeah, it's it's a compositional voice. I mean, it's a part that one has to really consider and write for in terms of how you put it all together. Yeah,
yeah, I love the
it's like another performer. The other, it's like, if it were not electronic, maybe that would have been another person playing. So it's, yeah,
well, let's talk a little bit about the performer, Kate Stenberg, the
yeah,
violinist. She does
yeah.
a fantastic job on this recording. Can you tell us about her a little bit?
Oh yeah, Kate is an incredible violinist, and she, we met. She for a long time played with the Del Sol Quartet, which is an excellent group in San Francisco, and I think she actually was one of the founding members and played with them for many, many, many years. And that's actually how I met her. I met her through doing a project with Del Sol, and around 2016 she left the group to just be a solo performer, and one of the things she started doing was commissioning people to write pieces for her, and she asked me to write a piece. So she has a lot of experience playing with electronics, playing in lots of different contexts, with certainly with new music. She's been commissioning new music her whole career, but this particular piece interestingly came about. She had a connection with a dance company um, in San Francisco, and the dance company wanted to do a piece with Kate, where Kate would be playing the music and be on stage with the dancers. And so Kate actually thought that this might be an interesting context for me to write her a piece. So I did. So it was really thinking about Kate as both being a musician and also being on stage, and part of this collaboration with the dancers. And I knew I had heard a lot of her recordings and I had worked with her, so I kind of had a sense of her playing, and I just tried to write a piece that I felt would really allow her to just completely show her full range of capabilities as a performer and a violinist. And I think she actually absolutely does an incredible job with it.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I mean, we haven't spoken in 8 months, I think. And the last time we talked, we were in the pandemic. You talked about your kids in school and you talked about teaching yourself and dealing with everything. I mean, now here we are, a year into it. What's been going on with you in wake
Yeah.
of the pandemic?
Oh, it's I think it's gotten a little better. It's still hard, but things have seems like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm getting my second vaccine dose tomorrow. That's really
Yeah,
exciting. But
good.
what's going on with me? I don't know if I was talking. I don't know if I mentioned it when we spoke last time, but I had two main projects over the pandemic that I think have really helped pull me through. Certainly creatively, um, I actually scored my. I did my first film score, which was really actually a perfect project for right now. I scored a documentary, actually about Charlie Chaplin, which is a really cool feature-length documentary. I don't know what I have the details on when it will be released, but hopefully this coming year it'll be released. But that was just the perfect pandemic project because it really involved mostly for most of the time me creating demos, sending them to the director, feedback back and forth. It was very collaborative, but it was also I could work on it just at home. And so it felt amazing to have this big project with a big goal and feeling like I could work effectively from where I was, not needing to be with other people. And then actually a really exciting thing about a month ago, finally was finished, the score was finished. I spent a week in the studio recording that score. It ended up being about 60 minutes of music. And it was such a cathartic experience after this whole year to be with musicians in a studio recording this work that I had been doing for a year. It really felt great, and it really helped me, I think, get through this time creatively, just to have that goal and to finally be able to make it happen. So that was a big thing that happened for me. And the other thing, I had a percussion duo that I wrote kind of in the middle of that, which was a pretty substantial piece that I'm really excited about. It's called Evergreen. It's for a really wonderful group called the Arcs Duo, based in Seattle, and it's another one of these kind of big pieces. I don't know what it is, but I'm actually trying to write shorter pieces, but it's another 30-minute multi-movement affair. And I'm really proud of that one. And they premiered it in March, a virtual premiere, and did a great job. And they're going to be trying to play it more. Eventually, we'll try to get a recording and all that. I'm sure I'll let you know about it when all that happens. But yeah, so creatively, I've managed to keep myself busy, and on the home front, things are hanging together. Sometimes it feels like by a thread, but but
Yeah,
it's hanging together.
yeah.
I can't complain. So I feel very lucky
Well,
that
that's
that
great.
yeah.
I'm especially excited to hear that you've written film music because I've always thought your music was so cinematic.
Oh,
That's
thank
wonderful.
you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And I get that. I've gotten that before, um and I agree. But the thing that I learned about this process is, well, it was very enjoyable. Just because your music is cinematic doesn't it's not the same thing as writing for film, because actually the most challenging part was working within a director's vision. It's really
Mm.
different when you are a composer working on your own, writing a commission. I mean, you are the composer in that scenario is like the director. Whereas when you're working on a film, you're sort of serving that vision. It can be a back and forth, it can be a collaboration, but you're not the main voice. And so in a way, it's like I always found myself writing too much. You know what I mean? Like it was like if there was a musical situation where maybe there were three layers and maybe one layer is like the foreground, and to my ear it's like this is the best part. Like this is great. This is so good. The director would always be like, "Well, can we have a little bit less? Maybe we just take away this thing." And every time it was when he said to take away something, it was precisely the thing that I thought was so awesome. And what I finally realized, it's nothing, that it was not personal, and it was not about, oh, is this good or is this bad. It's simply about the fact that the music is in counterpoint in dialogue with the visual, with the picture, with the dialogue, with the storytelling arc. It's just one layer, and it has to fit in. And so my instincts as a composer to create this complete experience that can hold its own, like on a stage or a recording, I needed to dial it back. Which was really it was really cool to learn how to do that and to be involved in that process. It was a very interesting process. I was happy to do it and very lucky to do it.
Well, you can save all those moments you're talking about for your own album, right? We'll do the
Exactly.
Honstein cut. We'll,
Yes,
we'll we'll get
exactly.
that.
No, absolutely. I totally
Yeah.
look at it that way. So I'll look forward to finding ways to work it in.
Great. I've been
Yeah.
talking with the composer Robert Honstein, who has a new recording out, Middle Ground, available as a digital download. Now, people can get this in a number of places. I got it off my Apple Music so I can listen to it while I'm taking nature walks, you know,
Nice.
because I like to have a little stimulation in the way of music there, and more than just, you know, something in tempo that I can walk to. But they go to otherminds.org, or they go to your
Yeah.
website, or?
Otherminds.org or Bandcamp,
Okay.
or my website. My website has the links to all of the possible places, but it's everywhere you could expect.
Okay.
Spotify, Bandcamp, Amazon, Apple Music. I mean, I always say, and it's not just for me, but for all artists, I mean, I think a platform like Bandcamp is the best, just in terms of, you know, if you're generous enough to want to purchase it, that is where most of it goes to the artists. Whereas, you know, Spotify, it's a little bit different model, but it's widely available. Any of these places, you'll be able to find it. Yeah,
Great. Well, thanks so
yeah.
much for checking in and telling us about this great music.
Thank you, Brad. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and really appreciate you taking the time. And thank you.